Al Capone. The name conjures images of a ruthless gangster, a cold-blooded killer, the very embodiment of organized crime. But what about the man behind the myth? This is the story of Al Capone, the man few people knew, a man who, despite his brutality, held on to a surprising tenderness for his family. The streets of early 20th century Brooklyn were a breeding ground for young toughs like Al Capone. Poverty, coupled with the influx of immigrants, created a volatile environment. Gangs proliferated, each vying for control of gambling, prostitution, and other illicit activities. Capone, with his natural charisma and penchant for violence, thrived in this chaotic world. He dropped out of school at 14, taking on odd jobs while running errands for local gangsters. One such gangster was Johnny Torrio, a rising star in the 5 Points gang. Recognizing Capone's potential, Torrio took him under his wing. He taught him the intricacies of the criminal underworld, the importance of loyalty, and the effectiveness of brute force. Capone, eager to please and quick to learn, became Torrio's protege. It was during this time that Capone received the infamous scar that would earn him the nickname Scarface. He made an off-color remark to a woman, unaware that she was the sister of a local gangster, Frank Galusio, who attacked Capone with a knife, slashing his face 3 times. The incident with Galusio was a turning point for Capone. It solidified his reputation as a dangerous man, someone not to be trifled with. But it also instilled in him a deep sense of insecurity. He became self-conscious about his appearance, often covering the left side of his face with his hand when being photographed. Despite his newfound notoriety, Capone remained fiercely loyal to Johnny Torrio. When Torrio decided to relocate to Chicago in 1920, Capone followed without hesitation. Chicago, with its wide-open spaces and lax law enforcement, offered opportunities that dwarfed those of New York. Capone's early years in Chicago were marked by a rapid ascent through the ranks of the Chicago outfit. His ambition, however, would soon put him at odds with his mentor. Chicago in the 1920s was a city in the throes of Prohibition. The nationwide ban on alcohol, far from curbing its consumption, had created a thriving black market. Bootleggers and gangsters stepped in to fill the void, smuggling liquor from Canada and other parts of the U.S. Torrio, with his old-world sensibilities, preferred negotiation and diplomacy to maintain control. Capone, however, saw violence as a more effective tool. This difference in approach led to a rift between the two men. In 1925, Torrio, shaken by an assassination attempt by a rival gang, decided to retire. He relinquished control of the Chicago outfit to Capone. At the age of 26, Al Capone became the undisputed king of Chicago's underworld. With Torrio out of the picture, Capone wasted no time in consolidating his power. He expanded the outfit's operations, branching out into gambling, prostitution, and even legitimate businesses like laundries and bakeries. But bootlegging remained his most profitable venture. He established a complex network of breweries, distilleries, and speakeasies, flooding the city with illegal alcohol. Capone's ruthlessness became legendary. He eliminated rivals with brutal efficiency, often resorting to public displays of violence to instill fear and maintain control. His enforcers, armed with Tommy guns and sawed-off shotguns, became a familiar sight on the streets of Chicago. But Capone was also a shrewd businessman. He understood the importance of public image. He cultivated relationships with politicians, judges, and police officials, bribing them to look the other way. He presented himself as a man of the people, a benefactor to the poor and downtrodden. By the late 1920s, Al Capone was at the zenith of his power. He had transformed the Chicago outfit into a well-oiled criminal machine, generating millions of dollars annually. His influence extended far beyond the underworld, reaching into the very fabric of Chicago society. He controlled politicians, judges, and law enforcement officials, ensuring that his criminal activities continued unhindered. Capone flaunted his wealth with impunity. He resided in a luxurious suite at the Metropole Hotel, surrounded by bodyguards and hangers-on. He donned expensive suits, drove flashy cars, and frequented the city's most exclusive nightclubs. His every whim was catered to, his every desire fulfilled. But Capone's reign of terror came at a cost. Chicago's murder rate soared during his time in power. The myth of Al Capone, the benevolent gangster, began to crumble as the true extent of his brutality became apparent. Despite the escalating violence, Capone continued to cultivate his image as a man of the people. He opened soup kitchens during the Depression, providing meals to the city's poor and unemployed. He donated to charities and presented himself as a benefactor, a modern-day Robin Hood. This carefully crafted image resonated with some, particularly those who had benefited from his generosity. However, Capone's philanthropy was a calculated ploy to deflect attention from his criminal activities and garner public support. The soup kitchens, while providing much-needed relief, were also a reminder of the economic hardship that Capone himself had helped create. The truth was that Capone's criminal empire thrived on the misery of others. Capone's Robin Hood persona was a carefully constructed facade, a dangerous illusion that masked the true nature of his reign. The illusion of Al Capone, the benevolent gangster, was shattered on Valentine's Day, 1929. On that fateful day, 4 of Capone's men, disguised as police officers, entered a garage on Chicago's north side and gunned down 7 members of a rival gang led by Bugs Moran. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre, as it came to be known, was a brazen act of violence that shocked the nation. Although Capone had an alibi for the time of the massacre, few doubted his involvement. The massacre was widely seen as a desperate attempt to eliminate his rivals and maintain control of the city's underworld. However, the brutality of the act, the cold-blooded murder of 7 men in broad daylight, turned public opinion against him. The massacre exposed the true nature of Capone's reign, shattering the myth of the benevolent gangster. The public outcry following the massacre was immense. Newspapers across the country condemned the violence, demanding that the authorities bring Capone to justice. The walls were closing in on Al Capone. The task of bringing down Al Capone fell to Elliot Ness, a young and ambitious Treasury Department agent. Ness assembled a team of incorruptible agents dubbed the Untouchables by the press and set about dismantling Capone's empire. They targeted his bootlegging operations, raiding breweries and speakeasies, seizing illegal liquor, and arresting his associates. Capone, accustomed to operating with impunity, was enraged. He tried to bribe Ness and his men, but they refused to be bought. He then resorted to intimidation, threatening their families and placing bounties on their heads. But Ness and his team remained undeterred, their relentless pursuit of Capone continuing unabated. Despite their efforts, Ness and his team were unable to directly link Capone to the violence that plagued Chicago. Their opportunity came in the form of tax evasion. In 1931, Al Capone was indicted on 22 counts of tax evasion. The trial was a media sensation, with reporters from across the country flocking to Chicago to cover the downfall of the notorious gangster. Despite his attempts to bribe jurors and intimidate witnesses, Capone was found guilty on 5 counts. He was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison, a stunning fall from grace for the once untouchable crime lord. Capone's imprisonment marked the end of an era. The myth of the invincible gangster was shattered. His empire, built on violence and corruption, crumbled without his leadership. Capone's time in prison was a far cry from his luxurious life in Chicago. He was diagnosed with syphilis, a consequence of his years spent frequenting brothels. His physical and mental health deteriorated, his once sharp mind clouded by disease. Al Capone was released from prison in 1939, his health broken and his spirit crushed. He spent his remaining years in seclusion at his estate in Florida, his mind ravaged by syphilis. He died in 1947 at the age of 48, his once formidable body wasted by disease. Capone's legacy is a complex one. He was a ruthless gangster who terrorized a city, a cold-blooded killer responsible for countless deaths. But he was also a product of his time, a reflection of the social and economic forces that shaped early 20th century America. His rise to power was facilitated by Prohibition, a misguided social experiment that created a thriving black market and empowered organized crime. Al Capone, the gangster, the myth, the man, remains an enduring figure, his legacy forever intertwined with the violence, corruption, and glamour of 1920s Chicago.